Welcome to Saving Europe. I'm the novelist and historian Henry Viner Brooks, and in this series we're following the lives and travels of two of history's unsung heroes. The decisive leadership shown by the 6th century monk Columbanus and the 20th century statesman Robert Schuman helped rescue Western civilization in two very different dark ages. So, joined by my two sons, I'm on a 4,000-mile, 12-country post-Brexit odyssey to find out if these men and these dark ages can teach us anything for today. This week on Saving Europe, it's the snake pit of religion and politics. When Columbanus inadvertently meddles in the dynastic succession, it is a step too far. He brings on himself and his Irish followers quite literally the unthinkable.
This journey would almost break him.
We will discover the mortal remains of Gaul's brother.
I can see a skull. The last time he ever saw his brother alive was here.
But also see that even within these unfolding hardships, new possibilities emerge and new institutions are built that will spur European renewal after the collapse of the Roman Empire.
Let's step over the barrier and get a bit closer.
But first, we're on our way to a very special place. A quick reminder, if you haven't already subscribed, then please do so now, and remember to click the little bell so you can get notifications of the 50 new video shorts that we'll be releasing this year. Only a few years after establishing his first startup in Angray, Columbanus was invited by King Guntram to expand his operations to the fortified Gallo-Roman settlement of Luxeuil-les-Bains, just 7 miles west. Far from being a wilderness retreat, modern-day Luxeuil-les-Bains was on an important north-south route. Jacques Proudhon of the Friends of Columbanus agreed to give us a whistle-stop tour of the place.
Oh, bonjour Jacques. Henri, bonjour. Comment ça va?
Okay, Jack. This is one of the reasons why Luxeuil became so important in antiquity. Thermal springs. Thermal springs, curative springs. If you're ill, you'll do anything for an answer. I think this must have appealed to Columbanus, the man who, the manifestation of his own spiritual gifts of healing, made him so famous. I think here, possessing the site of the curative springs, occupying pagan temples, was an important part of their statement that Christianity had come not just to replace paganism, but to preserve the best parts of that saner paganism.
Which is my clumsy way of saying that the pagan cults, like all systems of religion and philosophy, sought to fulfill our need for a meaningful connection, not just with the natural world, but also with that supernatural power that we intuitively know underpins it. Paganism's failure to ultimately satisfy that need at the deepest level led not only to the cultural exhaustion of late antiquity, but also to a legitimation crisis not dissimilar from our own in late modernity. Columbanus is essentially stepping into the breach, offering traumatized Europeans Jesus Christ as the answer to all that paganism couldn't deliver. Or put it another way, the Pax Christi as an antidote for the failure of the Pax
You can see
Romana.
the water behind me, a place continually in use from antiquity. By the time Columbanus comes here, it's a ruin. But Jonas says this: the site here was constructed with unusual skill. A great number of stone idols, which in old heathen times had been worshipped with horrible rites, stood in a forest near at hand. Here then, the excellent man began to build a monastery. At the news, people streamed in from all directions in order to consecrate themselves to the practice of religion, so that the number of monks scarcely had sufficient room. The children of the nobles strove to come thither, despising the trappings of the world and the pomp of present wealth. They sought eternal rewards. So they said in Bath, where people flocked for centuries, they used to skim the scum from all the pussy wounds off the water each morning before everyone else got in with their pussy wounds to be healed. It just shows that people are desperate for answers, and ultimate answers are sometimes linked with illness because you come against an irreducible human difficulty. When you're suddenly sick and no one can help you, you're suddenly reduced, all your plans come to nothing. I think Columbanus liked the idea. Not only is he on a main thoroughfare now, north and south, but also where there was pagan healing, now there is Christian healing. And it's the washing still going on. Although this water, Jacques says, is cold today. I bet they're not letting you in there for free. The Abbey is, you can't quite see it, it's just behind the buildings, another, few hundred metres.
Once the premier monastery in all Burgundy, the Abbey buildings are now a school, and much of what still remains dates to the 18th century. But even as I walked through room after room, I had to remind myself that the overarching lesson that these walls preach is not one of permanence, but of the fragility of civilization. Before Columbanus' time, Attila the Hun levelled Luxeuvium in 451, and after Columbanus' time, first the Muslims, then the Vikings, then the Magyars also came to kill and plunder. The abbots of Luxeuil knew they might one day be martyrs, and indeed one was. Nevertheless, through their successive building programs and the sheer persistence of the monks, Luxeuil became a formidable spiritual, educational and healing centre. Students from here founded monasteries throughout the length and the breadth of Europe. The headmaster very kindly welcomed us to film inside the Abbey buildings, and even supplied a very helpful English-speaking teacher called Nicole to show us round the various rooms and even the small museum which houses some of the historic treasures from the Abbey.
So it's amazing. So this is obviously a later chapel from the 17th, 18th century. And they're repairing the roof and there's plaster coming down. And all round there are stained glass windows with people like Eustachius, other abbots, Atala, Columban. I'll show you.
Those old the armory,
Yes.
city,
Yeah.
was a monastery,
Besancon. Okay, yeah.
Columban monastery. So Saint-Valéry, Noyon,
Yeah.
Bregenz, Joie.
Nicole, you say they are founded
They are funded by monks from
Luxeuil. Yeah.
On each side of the painting, there is the armory of the four monasteries funded by Saint Columban.
Yes.
Bobbio,
yeah,
Luxeuil, Fontaine. The other Luxeuil is Angers.
I see.
Angers.
Yeah.
And the four country important island, France and Italy, and Switzerland by the 19th century for Sangal.
So you have that the symbolism, so everything about Columbanus's journeys are represented, his own foundations, and then in all under each of these roundels are written the cities like Besancon, Verdun, where monasteries were founded by people who studied at Luxeuil. So it's an incredible legacy. So Luxeuil became one of the great mother monasteries in France. A later writer says, what monastery does not boast of having some scholar trained at Luxeuil? And those guys walked these cloisters. One of the great continental monasteries, renowned for its scholarship.
The medieval cloister still survives, and it is an evocative reminder of the place that Luxeuil once was. The great abbey itself still stands, guarded by a statue of Columbanus denouncing the secular elites of his own age. In the end, it was not the axes of the barbarians, but the hammers of an all too familiar dogmatic secularism that gave the final blow to the abbey. During the French Revolution, it was closed and its property repurposed. The great trove of manuscripts were burnt by a mob thinking they were destroying the title deeds for the abbey's property. Only one page of one manuscript in the Irish minuscule font still survives, and only that because it was being used in the binding of another book.
Driving on a road that I'd imagine Columbanus must have known. Road to Fontanes, Luxeuil, to find where he founded his third monastery in this area. Comes through a beautiful forest and just dropping down now. we're talking maybe 7 kilometres north.
There is little left today of the third monastery founded by Columbanus. It appears that the monastic buildings are now a farm and the priory itself an elegant private home. The only other remains that Jack could show me were the stone sarcophagi in the church, which may once have contained the bones of one of Columbanus' friends.
So yeah, so a 7th century sarcophagi. It's a good seal. No decoration at all. Ah, unless it's this. No. Just the chisel marks. This looks slightly flatter. So maybe not an abbot. Right, okay. Yeah, Columban.
Columban avec le plan du monastère.
Yeah.
Le plan du monastère.
The 19th century glass panels valorised the Irishman, but I couldn't help escape the feeling that Columbanus might have preferred something a little less ornamental and more practical. 3 years after Guntram died, his sister-in-law Brunhilde and her teenage grandson, Theodoric II, became the new power in the land. And in Brunhilde's Burgundy, the clergy were to know their place. Trouble was, no one seems to have told Columbanus. In the end, she would play an admirable Jezebel to his Elijah in a personal battle over many years which would only end in her grisly death. But it was not just Theodoric II's court. Columbanus was also at odds with the Gallic bishops over church authority and practices like the dating of Easter. Columbanus humoured the bishops in a letter but refused to appear in person before them. "I am not the author of Divergence," he wrote. "I came as a poor stranger into these parts for the cause of Christ our Saviour. One thing alone I ask you, Holy Fathers, permit me to live in silence in these forests near the bones of 17 of my brethren who are now dead." In the end, he appealed over their heads to the Bishop of Rome, Gregory the Great. It put Gregory in an impossible position, and if there was an answer to that letter, it is lost to history. In effect, Columbanus was on his own, a stranger in a strange land.
You know, there came a day when Columbanus was chucked out for upsetting the monarch. One day he went to see the king and the queen grandmother, Brunhilde, the great survivor. She said to him, "Well, what do you come and give a blessing on the king's sons?" Well, they were not the king's sons. And he was quite keen to call them bastards. And it was just a step too far. I think in his eagerness to despise the worldly trappings, he had forgotten that these Merovingian monarchs had provided that modicum of stability that is needed for somewhere like this, even this little monastery at Angray, to survive. He'd forgotten his manners. It's very difficult when you have that type of focused personality. The king came here once, and Columbanus taunts him. He says, in effect, "You're going to make me a martyr? Go on, do it. But you know, God's judgment is on you." And the king said, "Hey, listen, I know what you want. You want to be a martyr. I'm not going to do it. I'm not playing that game." Theodoric was, he was young. Columbanus, he's a 60-year-old man. He could take anything, but it was what he was about to put his followers through that was one of the more heartbreaking aspects. A nobleman, I think Bardolph he was called, was sent to remove Columban by force. We're on our way to Lure, where part of the sorrow of that will become more immediate. We're in the town of Lure, looking for a famous abbey. I've not seen any signs for it yet. Maybe there's a sign up here.
somewhere down this way. In fact, I'll be surprised if this building here on the left.
I think that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, let's have a little bit of parkage.
This is Lure. We're about 20 k's maybe from Luxeuil, and there's not much old to see here, but I wanted to talk about one of the disciples. There's a guy called Domgal who came from Bangor with Columbanus. Also, it is likely that he is Gaul's older brother. He's variously known as Exile, round here he's known as Exile, but also Dicol in Ireland as well. So he's 20 years older. When Columbanus is chucked out by Theodoric and Brunhild, they get this far and Domgal can't go any further. He's probably in his 70s. So he stays in a hermitage here at Lure, and around him builds not just this monastery but this town. This is the remnant of it. It's now a government building. This must have been heartbreaking, I think, for Gaul particularly, that his older brother is now not with them. We don't know what kind of effect that would have had on Gaul, but he went on with Columbanus all the way on this enormous journey they were about to have in a great circuit around France and eventually up the Rhine toward the Alps, Bregenz, where he ended up staying. So there's a human story we know nothing about here, a human drama. The last time he ever saw his brother alive was here. They must have kissed, parted, and that. And so they stop here. It's very moving. And it's almost like it was wherever Columbanus's troubles took him, even out of the troubles good was coming. And this place was acknowledged by the later rulers. We're here for a very special reason. I've just read that some 18th century church of St. Martin, they have a relic. Please let me add that I'm not into relics, okay? It's not my favourite thing. Yeah, okay, that's pretty grim. So what they're saying is in Latin it's the Gaul's brother and also Columbanus. So you've got the two guys, a bit of a mixture. No, I don't think anyone knows whose is whose. I can see a skull. I can see femur, maybe. Some pretty big bones anyway. See, if I was an anthropologist, I'd be able to tell a lot from the bones, but I'm not. Let's step over the barrier and get a bit closer. And so look, that's quite a. It looks like a leg bone. You got yourself a. That's a skull. It's interesting, the stitching on the skull. I don't think we should underestimate the price that those guys paid for following this extraordinary man. And we know that it broke Columban's heart to leave. But also, in some ways, he could have not have been quite so angsty toward the crown. Part of this Neoplatonic dualism that got into Egyptian Christianity, which then was passed up to Ireland and down to here, was this disdain of the world. Well, frankly, he should have been grateful. Not quite so strident, not quite so Olympian in his attitudes. Truth without grace is not what we want. The cost would be high, but he'd always intended to go to Italy, so it turns out by this means that's how we got there. But it would be a long, hard route, and the personal cost would be high. That's what I remember visiting Lure today. in Besancon. This place is dominated by a citadel, which is across the other side of the river. I think this place is, from what I remember of the map, it's a bit like Durham, in that the river snakes round the town, so it's rather an attractive prospect, but also, of course, more easily fortified. We're coming up to the river here. So this is the Riviera of Besancon. It's pretty busy today on the outskirts of town. It's about 5 o'clock French time, and I think people want to get home. And there's been a baking hot day, even though we're at the end of September. It's a nice place. Columbanus came here too. One day he was removed forcibly from the monastery, brought here to Besancon. He was locked up, but interestingly, when he was locked up, he pardoned the other people who were locked up with him and set them free. He then let himself go. He went back to his monastery, and of course it's then that the court, the Queen Mother, grandmother I'd imagine, is just like, right, that's it, we get rid of the Irish. No more Irish, let's get rid of them. And so they send the guys back. This time, they're going. And they say that no Irishman can stay at Luxeuil in their kingdom. And they are escorted this way, again, which is a long way from Luxeuil south, on this very circuitous route across to Autun. And I wonder whether Columbanus had a premonition, because it was at Autun, very near Bryn Hills, the estates of Brocaria. It was at Autun that they decreed, almost outlawed Columbanus's rule 100 years later, and made all of his monasteries Benedictine in their realm. So poor Columbanus. The one thing that he'd never expected to happen had just happened. He'd embraced the white martyrdom. He'd given up his homeland, permanent exile. The one thing he never thought, I mean, he may be expected to be killed by savages, but he never expected to be returned to Ireland. Jonas says that they all wanted to go into exile with their abbot, even if they were given a choice or not. That's not clear. As far as I understand it, the Irish were exiled. But of course there would be some native Franks there, but they all wanted to go with Columbanus. Their narrative was already still tight bound with this man of God. I want to read those words again that Columbanus says at the end of this. We're at the beginning of this grueling journey for him, but at the end he says this from Nantes. He writes back here to Atala, the first abbot. He says, "I confess that I am broken, for I have wished to help everyone. They fought against me without cause. And while I trusted everyone, they have driven me almost mad. I wanted to write you a tearful letter, but my grief is shut up within. The tears flow, but it is better to check the fountain, for it is unbecoming for a brave soldier to lament in battle." And that is the lament of a broken-hearted dreamer on the verge of collapse. Written in 610 AD, it reaches across time to us. So this journey would almost break him. He's got hundreds and hundreds of miles. He's going to be passing Autun, Vézelay, Orléans, right the way down through Tours, and all the way he'll suffer ignominies. And he'll also see his own friends suffer too at the hands of who he calls his enemies. It's an extraordinary thought that it all happened in places like this.
Next time on Saving Europe, we follow Columbanus on a 400-mile voyage of shame and humiliation down the Loire toward Nantes. Calling in at Orléans and Tours, we come face to face with the carnivorous monsters of that river. And we also camp out at Martin's 4th century monastery, a cultural powerhouse without which Western civilization might have taken a very different course. All this and more next time on Saving Europe. Remember also that this journey was part of the research for a book which uses the lives of Columbanus and Schuman as an analytical lens to view the course of Western civilization. Do follow the links below to find out more. Please let us know what you thought of this episode, what you liked, what you didn't, what was new to you, what you'd like us to explore further. Just start a conversation below in the comments section. And of course, if you found the content helpful, then we're pretty sure you're going to like this next one suggested here. But also while you're there, don't forget to help us by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.